Welcome to Concerned Citizens Presents. Concerned Citizens of Laguna Woods is an organization dedicated to peace, economic and social justice, good government, and a clean environment. Every month, we invite an expert to enlighten us on a topic related to our mission. Because Village TV videotapes these presentations, we can share that expertise with a larger audience. We hope you enjoy today's broadcast.
Hi, everybody. I'm Barbara Seary with the Program Committee, and we are so pleased to present tonight our speaker, Mr. Marc Novicoff. Marc is a Phi Beta Kappa graduate from Dartmouth, where he studied history and was editor-in-chief of the Dartmouth Political Times. Always interested in politics, Marc also interned for Congressman Henry Cuellar and has gone on to a career in journalism with work at the Washington Monthly, the political blog Slow Boring, and most recently at Politico, where he focused on affirmative action after last year's Supreme Court decision. And it is from this article and the research that he did in this subject about how colleges and universities are struggling to maintain diversity that serves as the basis for his topic tonight, for his lecture tonight. And one thing we should probably know about Marc is this guy apparently walked 45 miles in one day on the Appalachian Trail. Now, I have exaggerated many times how many miles I've hiked, but I get the feeling this guy really did it. And I can only imagine the blisters on his feet and the shape of his boots afterwards. So I want to invite and welcome our very talented long distance walker, Marc Novicoff. Welcome, Marc.
Thank you, Barbara. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen. Hopefully it goes well. Okay, great. So yeah, today I'll be talking about the demise of affirmative action. I'm Marc Novicoff. So we're going to start with some history. For some of you, for all of you, I guess, this occurred during your life. It did not occur during mine, but we're going to start with the civil rights movement. So the civil rights movement, as you all know, was a movement led by Black people to ensure and secure for themselves equal rights. So you'll see Martin Luther King Jr. on your screen, who you all recognize. He has a famous speech. I have a dream speech, and he said, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character," right? So the movement was to secure equal rights for Black people and white people, to have them treated equally in this country. But as the civil rights movement aged, and after they secured legal equal rights in the law, after discrimination was outlawed in the United States on the basis of race, the goals of the movement stated, should we be focusing entirely on just securing this legal equality that we've now achieved? Should we push for more? Should we push for reparations? Should we push for, something special for Black people in exchange for having been treated so poorly for hundreds of years? And this set off a debate among civil rights leaders, right? Is legal equality all that we want, or do we want more, right? So Martin Luther King died very shortly into this debate, but we know a little bit of what he thought. He said a society that has done something special against the Negro for hundreds of years must now do something special for the Negro. He also had a quote: in 1863, the Negro was told that he was free as a result of the Emancipation Proclamation being signed by Abraham Lincoln, but he was not given any land to make that freedom meaningful. It was something like keeping a person in prison for a number of years and suddenly discovering that that person is not guilty of the crime for which he was convicted, and you just go up to him and you say, "Now you are free," but you don't give him any bus fare to get to town. So there was a debate. Martin Luther King seemed to be on the side of equal treatment, but he also seemed to be on the side that Black people ought to have something special done for them because they had been mistreated for so long. So as the debate started to rage on, started to be multiple sides to it. On your screen, you see Bayard Rustin. He organized the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom that Martin Luther King Jr. gave his address at. Bayard Rustin was an opponent of affirmative action and an opponent of any sort of special treatment. He wanted legal equality. Once he had gotten legal equality, he said, "We don't want any special favors. Special favors don't help us, and we just wanted legal equality," right? And then there were other leaders that disagreed with him. The civil rights movement was also compelling, as many of you remember. It was compelling to the entire political system and to the president of the United States, John F. Kennedy, at the time. He wrote in an executive order, he coined the term affirmative action in this executive order. The contractor will take affirmative action to ensure that applicants are employed and that employees are treated during employment without regard to their race, creed, color, or national origin. So he said, something that sounds a little bit confusing today now that we know what affirmative action means, but he said we have to take affirmative action to ensure that everyone is treated equally. And in 1965, Lyndon Baines Johnson, who became president after John F. Kennedy was assassinated, Lyndon Baines Johnson had an executive order of his own where he wrote the exact same phrase. Contractor will take affirmative action to ensure that applicants are employed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They had the exact same prose on this. They said there must be affirmative action taken to ensure that everyone is treated equally, right? It's a little bit confusing, but in a time when so many employers, so many universities had been run by people who did not take Black people seriously, who discriminated against them, this sentence made sense. We have to take affirmative action to ensure that everybody is treated equally. But it wasn't exactly clear from the standpoint of the employers, from the standpoint of college administrators, what to do with this, right? We have to take affirmative action to ensure that everyone is treated equally, right? So Lyndon Baines Johnson had a quote about this. He tried to make it a little bit more clear. Said, "You do not take a person who for years has been hobbled by chains and liberate him, bring him up to the starting line of a race, and then say you are free to compete with all the others and still justly believe that you have been completely fair." So again, he kind of echoes the statement by Martin Luther King Jr. Something special has been done against Black people. Something special must be done for them, right? And then people go to work. Employers go to work. They have to hire people. University administrators have to let people into college. There are real decisions that have to be made, and you sometimes get a white applicant, and you sometimes get a Black applicant. How exactly do I treat that? I know I have to take affirmative action, but I also know I have to treat everybody equally, right? So this takes on a special meaning in universities, and this is where we get into the university admissions office. Whoever gets to go to college at a particular place, whoever gets to go to medical school at a particular place, is at the hands of a room of people, not usually a very big room, who have read an essay by you, who have looked at your test scores on a standardized test, who have looked at your grades either in high school or in college, and they have to decide, should you get in? And most schools, they decide almost everybody should get in. Most people go to non-selective universities. The biggest schools in the country, Texas A&M, University of Central Florida, these schools do not reject that many people. They accept most people. Most people pay the tuition, which isn't as expensive as elite schools. And they let most people in. And that's kind of the image that's on the right of your screen, right? You have this storied, old, a little broken down institution. The education is not going to be as amazing as it would be at an absolutely elite school, but they'll let you in, right? The door is open, right? So on the left, you have the much smaller, the much fewer elite school, right? Only a few people get to get in. Very, 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 very few people get to get in. Maybe 10% of the applicants, maybe even 5% of the applicants, if you're Harvard or Stanford. And so at that place, what happens is a lot more difficult. The admissions officers have to sit in a room and decide of, 50,000, 100,000 applicants. How do we decide which 2,000 to take? How do we decide which 1,500 to take? If you teach at Pomona, if you're the admissions officer at Pomona, we only are taking 400 kids and, 10,000 apply. How do we decide? It's very difficult, and there aren't that many of them, right? And they, at the time of the 60s and 70s, they see these executive orders. They see the civil rights movement, which, as I said, was compelling. They say we should be part of this. We should be part of including Black people in elite society, giving them the jobs they deserve, giving them equal rights, giving them what they fought for. But it was not at all clear exactly how. So they just went to the drawing board and they just attempted some things. So what was the first thing they attempted? Quotas. They first attempted quotas. And the reason they attempted quotas was because they already knew about quotas, because they used them against the Jews with the Jews from the 1910s and 20s, when Jews started entering this country in a large rate. And they used those quotas from the 1910s, 1920s, all the way up into the 1960s, right? On your screen on the left, you'll see a man by the name of Mr. Winternitz. He was the dean of Yale Medical School. They let in at the time about 100 students, 100 boys, men. He had a simple rule that he gave to his admissions officers. He said, we don't care exactly how you look at the students, exactly what criteria you look at, but you have a rule. Take no more than 5 Jews and no Black people. That was the simple rule that Mr. Winternitz set out for his medical school. This is in the 20s, and this was the policy up until the 30s, and they increased the number that the Jews were allowed to take, but it was the policy for decades. And for decades and decades and decades, there was a hard cap on the number of Jews that will be let into Yale Medical School. And that meant that if you were a talented Jewish man in college and you wanted to go to medical school, you might apply to Yale, but you're very, very, very unlikely to get in. All of you and your talented Jewish friends are all competing for 5 spots, right? So that led some extremely prominent, smart scientists like Jonas Salk, who went to NYU Medical School instead and went to other medical schools because, again, they could not go to Yale. There were only 5 spots for Jews. Only 5 of them could go. So schools have quotas as a tool. They had them for 50 years. And they said, well, what are we going to do for Black people? Let's give them a quota. Let's say, we had a cap on 5 Jews. Now it's 10 by now. Let's let in 3 Black people, right? We'll just have a number and we'll just hit that number, right? It was very, very simple system. And what that creates is you essentially just get parallel admissions processes. You have one process, that's the kind of white maze. White students, non-Jewish ones, are looking at this admissions process, and they're applying against each other. And then on the right, you have Black applicants, and they're just facing a completely different admissions process, just 2 parallel admissions processes. And so that's the way it worked from 1961, from the time that they're told, you guys should really take affirmative action to ensure that Black people are treated equally, to 1978, which is where we're gonna go next. So the decision, there's a Supreme Court decision known as Bakke in 1978, and this decision was a challenge to these quotas. It was a challenge given by a guy named Alan Bakke, who applied to University of California, Davis Medical School. That's kind of pictured in the middle. And he applied and he didn't get in, despite having very good MCATs and despite having very good grades and despite being a Marine veteran. And he thought, this is unfair. I seem on paper to be deserving, but I didn't get in. And some of the Black applicants I know, they have worse stats than me, worse MCATs. They did get in. So he sues. And the case finds its way all the way up to the Supreme Court, where all hell breaks loose. They do not know what to do because they think affirmative action is a good thing. We're supposed to do affirmative action, but this quota thing seems obviously racially discriminatory, and racial discrimination is illegal, right? We can't do this. So what they do, they issue 6 decisions between the 9 justices. They are really, really not sure what to do here. And the important takeaway from these 6 decisions is that they uphold affirmative action. They say you can't give Black applicants special consideration. That's not an issue. What's at issue is the quotas. You can give Black students special consideration, but you can't say we're going to let in 3 Black students. You just have to give them, you give them a little boost, right? You say to them yourself, these Black students have been through a lot. After all, they were all born in, 1950 or so, and they ought to have special consideration. But we're not going to use quotas. And to get around this sort of obviously racially discriminatory nature of giving Black people a little bit of a boost, they say, well, it's not reparations. This isn't Black people get a boost and white people don't. This is for the diversity of the campus. Educations suffer when everybody around you had the exact same experiences. You don't get to learn about other experiences. In a medical school, you might not meet a person who's ever known someone with sickle cell, which is, very common in the Black community. This is a way of saying Black people ought to be here, not because of slavery, but because they have important things to say, and we ought to listen to them, right? And so they ban quotas, and they protect affirmative action only for the purposes of diversity. It's not a reparations program, it's a diversity program. And this is the new status quo for decades, right? Colleges can give special consideration to Black people, but not quotas and not for reparations, only for diversity. And then in 2003, Grutter versus Bollinger and Gratz versus Bollinger. This takes the muddy water of Bakke and it makes it completely opaque. Now we have no idea what's going on. They said there's at the time at Bakke, they said no quotas and only for diversity. And so what do Grutter and Gratz do? It upholds affirmative action again, but it says you can't use a point system, right? So you can, again, give special consideration to Black people, but not quantifiable special consideration to Black people. You can't say being Black is worth 25 points. You can't say that. You can't give special consideration, but you can't say it's worth 25 points, right? Grutter says you can do affirmative action, you can give special consideration, and Gratz says no points. And this is a little bit confusing, right? And so the woman tasked with explaining this is Sandra Day O'Connor, the first woman to serve on the Supreme Court. And she was also the tie-breaking vote in this decision. And she says, we'll uphold affirmative action, no points. And then she says, but we expect that 25 years from now, the use of racial preferences will no longer be necessary to further the interest in student body diversity. In 25 years, we ought to have found something better than just giving Black people a leg up. Like, surely there has to be something easier than that. Maybe the achievement gap in grades or test scores will close by then. We'll figure it out. But this isn't going to be like a forever thing. We're just always giving special consideration to Black people, right? But she was wrong. We just kept giving special consideration to Black people for years and years and years. And so I'm going to explain a little bit about how affirmative action works when I was applying to college 5 years ago, right? And how it worked when my sister was applying to college 9 years ago. How it worked for most of your, let's say, grandkids who applied to college. When they applied to college and when I applied to college, this is how it works. So the important takeaway is we on the next few slides that from the 1960s to 2023, affirmative action became increasingly secret and confusing and counterproductive, right? We started out with Black students get 3 spots. Now we're at Black people get an innumerable amount of spots in a secret method which may or may not award points, but definitely doesn't involve any quotas. And we can't really tell you anything about it, right? That's what we end up with by the 2000s. So the first point that I want to make clear is that the quotas never disappeared. They just widened. So it went from, there used to be a cap, let's say 3 Black people at Yale Medical School. They just changed the cap. They just widened the range. Now you can have between 7 and 11. That's what the Yale admissions officers are basically doing. They're saying, out of 100 spots, we're not going to always have 8 Black students. That's a quota. We're going to have between 7 and 11 Black students, right? So you'll see that this is kind of just a verbal game, right? If you have a rough limit on the number of Black students, it's a quota. But if you take between 7 and 11, we're not going to call that quota. And the way that this becomes increasingly obvious to everybody that there's quotas is when Asian Americans start to immigrate, or Asians start to immigrate to America in the 60s. They have children who are disproportionately impressive, and those students want to apply to elite schools. And more and more and more Asian students start applying to elite schools in the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s. And yet the Asian percentage at elite schools will not budge, right? You'll see in this graph on the right, those blue bars in the back, those are millions of Asians who are 18 to 21. So in 1990, there's 400,000, Asian people between 18 and 21, right? By 2013, there's 900,000, right? But the percentage of Asians at the Ivy League schools will not budge. It has to stay between 10 and 20%, which again, the Ivy Leagues would tell you that's not a quota, but it's also kind of a quota, right? It never budges above 20%, even as the population doubles, right? It never budges. So the quotas never really disappeared. The quotas for Asians became more and more restrictive. Again, it's the same. There was kind of an Asian quota in 1990, It's kind of an Asian quota in 2013, and it's the same quota. It's about 20% of the class. So this is increasingly obvious that a quota is going on, and increasingly a little bit offensive to Asian people who also did not enslave anyone and did not pass any Jim Crow laws. I mean, if there's going to be reparations, why are the Asians giving them, right? They didn't even do anything. So this is the situation. And I'm going to give you a couple more things about affirmative action from 2003 to 2023. Second thing is a point system that we were told was going to be gone by Sandra Day O'Connor and Grutter and Gratz. The point system was also just hidden, right? The quotas just widened and the point system was just hidden, right? So some Princeton economists looked at this. They said to be African-American is roughly the same as getting about 230 points higher on your SAT when you apply. If you're Hispanic, it's the equivalent of doing about 185 points higher, assuming you're in the sort of upper middle range of the SAT. For Asians, it's like losing 50 points off your SAT. And again, the college just said, we aren't quantifying this. We don't have a point system. And that might be true. We don't know. They say we don't have a point system. It is quantifiable. They just don't quantify it, right? In none of their subpoena documents do they quantify it. But it is quantifiable, and some people have quantified it. And those people think that there's a huge boost to being Black and a pretty large boost to being Hispanic, and a sizable penalty for being Asian. So the point system didn't go away. The quotas didn't go away, right? So for 50 years, the Supreme Court has been issuing these decisions, and the colleges are not listening, right? They just hide the quotas, they hide the point system, but it never went away. So the other thing is that the racial gaps that Sandra Day O'Connor was hoping would close did not close. In America, in high schools, Black students still do a lot worse on average than white students, who still do a lot worse on average than Asian students. So because these achievement gaps in high school did not close, and the colleges, again, they kind of have these rough quotas. We want to have, 5 to 12% of our class be Black. We have to discriminate. We have to say, if you have great grades, but you're Asian, and this is the graph on the left, this is Harvard, and on the x-axis is kind of how academically talented you are. Imagine you're at your academic decile number 10. That means you're the 90th percentile or higher in grades and test scores. You have exceptional SATs, exceptional grades, but you're Asian. That's the blue line. So you're Asian, exceptional test scores, exceptional SATs. You have about an 11% chance of getting into Harvard. Let's say you have those exact same SAT scores and the exact same grades, but you're Black. You have a 55% chance of getting into Harvard. You have a 5 times better chance of getting into Harvard if you're Black with the same grades, same test scores as an Asian student. And this gets even more dramatic if you're a slightly less impressive student. Let's say you're in the 7th academic decile. You have 70th percentile SAT scores. You have 70th percentile grades among Harvard applicants. And you're Asian, you'll have a 5% chance of getting into Harvard. That's the blue line. Let me see if I can turn on a laser pointer and make this a little easier. Okay. So let's say you're right around here. You're an Asian student who's towards the top of the Harvard applicants, but you're not at the very top. You're in the 70th percentile of Harvard applicants. You're Asian, so you have a 5% chance of getting in with those SATs and those grades. Let's say you're Black. You have a 40% chance of getting in. That's an 8 times better chance if you're Black than if you're Asian with the same grades, same test scores. And again, Asians were not slave owners in America. They did not pass Jim Crow laws. So we have this weird program when I was applying to college that Black people have this huge leg up over Asian people. Again, the leg up over white people is sizable. It's a little more sizable with Asians, but it's sizable over white people too. You have this sizable gap, and Asians didn't really do anything wrong, right? So and on the right is UNC, University of North Carolina, really good state school. The same exact thing is going on, right? At every level of academic achievement, if you're Black, you have a much higher percentage chance of getting in than if you're Hispanic. And if you're Hispanic, you have a much higher chance of getting in than if you're white or Asian. And so because these racial gaps didn't close, because our sort of faith in the education system figured out, they'll just take Black students who are disproportionately poor And by the time they get to 12th grade, their grades, their test scores will be equal, right? That wasn't going to work. At 12th grade, Black students have lower SAT scores, lower grades on average. And so to get the kind of quota that you want, to get the 5 to 10% of Black students, you have to do these huge discriminations. So that's one more point. And this was even worse for graduate students, kind of incomprehensibly worse for graduate students, right? So for medical school, let's say that you have a 28 on your MCAT, your GPA in college was a 3.5, right? You're Asian, you have a 21% chance of getting into med school, getting into a particular med school. That same med school with those same MCATs, those same GPA, you're Black, you have an 81% chance of getting in. You're a shoo-in, right? But if you were Asian, you'd be 4 times less likely, right? At a lower MCAT, if you're Asian, you don't even need to apply. No reason. You will not get in. 6% chance. If you're Black with those same MCATs, GPA, you are likely to get in, right? Law school is where it becomes even more ridiculous, somehow even more ridiculous than medical school, right? To be a white student with a 97% chance of getting in, to be a white student who's a shoo-in, you have to have an 850 on an academic index that combines your grades and your test scores. You have to have an 850 and above to have a 97% chance of getting in. To have a 96% chance of getting in if you're Black, you just need a 710 on the same academic index, the same combination of LSATs and GPAs. So again, if you're a white student, you get a 710, 5%, right? If you're a Black student, you get a 710, 96%, right? So it's unbelievably dramatic in graduate schools because it's basically you've gone through 2 rounds of affirmative action, right? You've gone through the college level and you've gone to graduate school. It's kind of magnified the affirmative action. So another is that along the way, to justify this, what elite schools started to do was insult Asian personalities. That was their way out, right? Why do so many Asians who get good grades, why do they not get in? Well, it's because their personalities are less interesting. They have less, they have less going on, fewer extracurriculars. They're kind of robotic almost, right? And you can see this is racist. This is a stereotype. But this is what elite colleges kind of trap themselves into, right? So you'll see this graph here, this personal graph, right? On the right is, again, academic index decile. As you get up the academic index decile, as you get more and more impressive academically, you tend to get more impressive personally, right? You tend to come off smarter, you might be more involved in the things you do. But for Asians, the smarter you get, it doesn't really help your personality scores very much. And despite the fact that your academic scores, which are here on the left, those rise perfectly with academic index, your personal scores for Asians, they never really seem to budge. For Black students, if you do really well, you'll get a super high personality score. But if you're Asian, it's never quite going to budge. And the interesting question would be, well, are interviewers saying that they're Asian, the Asian interviewees are not as interesting? No, not at all. Alumni who interview white people say that they get an average score of 49, and the overall score from the alumni is 36. What about when interviewers interview Asian students? Well, they say Asian students are even more impressive, right? They say Asian students are very impressive in interviews. So then what is the cause of Asians getting lower and lower and lower personal scores if they only input for the personal score, which is this review from an alumni, is very positive, right? So there's something going on here that's increasingly insulting to Asians. And the most frustrating thing about this, right, is that after all this, after Asians are being hurt, after Black students are getting big leg up, there's still a fast track for really rich white students. There's still a fast track for them. So after all this, we still have the most absurd thing of all, which is a fast track for the rich and white, right? And those are mostly through recruited athletes. So if you imagine there's 168 extra students from the top 1% at an elite school like Harvard, there's 1,600 spots, and about 10% of those spots are taken up by extra students from the top 1% who wouldn't have been likely to get in otherwise. 52 of those are because their parents went to Harvard, right? 27 of those is because they were on the squash team at Harvard or they row at Harvard, right? Some amount of them is because their parents have donated $5 million to Harvard. right? So there's still these fast tracks for these rich white students. And that's incredibly frustrating. We have this two-tiered system, basically, where the white students who are not rich are hugely hurt by this affirmative action, but the white students who are really, really, really rich or good at squash or have a dad who went to Harvard, they are on the fast track, right? So it's kind of the worst of both worlds, right? The latter, I think this is the last point, is that the Black students who were getting in were not usually American, right? So when I went to Dartmouth, I had many African friends. I thought they were great. I played club soccer with them. There were tons of African students at Dartmouth, and there are tons of African students at Harvard, and there are tons of African students at all elite schools because they receive the same sort of bump that Black students do, but they were not, of course, their ancestors were not enslaved in America. They're from Africa, or their parents are from Africa. And so these two Black professors at Harvard, this is Henry Louis Gates Jr. and this is Laney Gunier, they did a study and they said most Black students at Harvard are West Indian or African. Only 33% of Harvard's Black student body had 4 grandparents descended from slaves, right? Most of these students are West African, they're African or they're West Indian, the Caribbean, or they're biracial, right? And not only are they not getting the spots, but the bump, some of them are kind of suffering from the bump, right? They got into a great school, but they're not as qualified as some of their other classmates, and they wind up having to choose easier classes, right? So this is on the right is kind of a chart about their kind of initial hopes for a major at Duke and their final major at Duke. So for white students, you'll see about 61% of them said they wanted to major in STEM, a natural science, engineering, econ. But by the end, only 50% do, because STEM is very hard. And I can tell you firsthand, at elite schools, they absolutely make the humanities classes a lot easier than the STEM classes. They are much easier. So for Black students, this is even more dramatic. 61% of them say they want to major in STEM. By the time they're done, only 30% are. Half of the students who wanted to major in STEM do not, because when they got there, they had to compete against people who had better SATs, better GPAs, and they struggled. They struggled a little bit. And this was especially true of Black men who received the largest bump. And for Black men, almost 70% wanted to major in STEM at Duke. By the end, only 36% do, right? So at these schools, not only are the Black students who are getting in mostly not American, or certainly not American descendants of slaves, but they're also kind of suffering from the bump. I mean, they graduate from Duke and they go on to good jobs. And in some ways, you could say that's worth it. In other ways, many of them wanted to be doctors, and they will not be doctors. Had they gone to a University of California, maybe they could have majored in biology, and maybe they could have gone on to be doctors. But they didn't go to University of California. They got into Duke, and then they went to Duke, and then they struggled there. So, and I guess this is the last point, is that it never at any point became popular. At no point was affirmative action ever popular. Civil rights movement, extremely popular. Martin Luther King hailed as a hero. The whole country saddened by his assassination deeply, right? But affirmative action never reached a high level of popularity, never. So this study on the left is in 2022. They asked people, what should be a major factor? What should be a minor factor in admissions, right? High school grades, people think this should be a major factor. Standardized test scores, people think major factor, right? Race or ethnicity. Only 7% of the entire country think race or ethnicity should be a major factor. And yet, it was a major factor, right? At Harvard, they claimed that without affirmative action, 50% of the Black students would not be there. That's what they say. So it's definitely a major factor, definitely a major factor. And only 7% of Americans think it should be a major factor. Only 19% of Americans think it should be a factor at all. Those people think it should be a minor factor. 7% think it should be a major factor, but almost no one thinks it should be a factor anyway, right? And this is not just like a polling error. We have voted on it on the ballot. So in many, many, many states, there's been ballot measures that say, do you want to get rid of affirmative action in your states, in the state schools in your state? And in all of those states, everyone shouts back loudly, no, we don't want affirmative action in our states. We do not want it, right? So in California in 1996, Californians were asked, Do you want affirmative action? They all shouted back, no, we don't want affirmative action, right? 55%, and this is one of the most liberal states in the country, 55% of them said we do not want affirmative action. So what did California's representatives do in 2020? They said, we'll put it back on the ballot. Surely the Californians have changed their mind. They're liberal, they're open-minded. These are Californians, right? They shouted back no even louder, right? They do not, Californians don't want affirmative action. Washingtonians don't want it. Michiganders don't want it. Nebraskans don't want it. Nobody in America likes affirmative action. There's very, very, very few people. So despite the fact that this program has been going on for decades and decades and decades, it never became really popular. This last graph is by a progressive group. They try to raise support for various progressive policies. And what they do is they poll a number of progressive policies. In this case, they polled 160 different progressive policies. They asked people, do you want the most popular one? Do you want Medicare to directly negotiate with pharmaceutical companies to lower prices? Extremely popular, right? Extremely popular. Then they ask about tons of other sort of progressive priorities. They ask about, defunding the police. Not very popular, right? When they ask about affirmative action, it is less popular than defunding the police. It is so unpopular. It is the second most unpopular of 160 of these progressive priorities. It is one of the most unpopular things that Democrats, that progressives, that liberals have ever been supportive of. It is very, very unpopular. So what happens in 2023 is the justices say no more. They say we cannot have the system anymore. And they say Harvard and UNC's admissions program violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. They are discriminatory. We cannot allow affirmative action programs anymore. But one thing they wanted to include was, well, how do you prevent a student from just talking about their race? So they answered back, well, we can't prevent that. At the same time, nothing prohibits universities from considering applicants' discussion about race affected the applicant's life. So if you say, I'm Black and it's affected me, there was police brutality in my neighborhood. It was high crime, right? There were a lot of issues in my neighborhood, in my schools that had to do with being Black. Being Black was a key part of my life, and I want to talk about it. Supreme Court says, okay, sure, you can talk about it. But universities may not simply establish through application essays or other means the regime we hold unlawful today. You can't just replace the question that says, are you Black, with an essay question that says, are you Black? That's the same question, right? It's just essay form. So they say you can't do that. But again, Supreme Court, not always they can't always perfectly predict what people are going to do. So this is where we get into the reaction of colleges, right? So the colleges have a few options on their plate, and I'm going to go over some of these options. Option one, giving up, right? Just saying, screw affirmative action. We tried for a few decades and we're done. It was never liked. It didn't really work. Whatever, we're done. That would be one option. They just calculate a formula. It takes grades and test scores, and that's it. And you're let in or you're not, right? That's how many countries work. If in France, if you want to go to a top engineering school, you take the standardized test. If you get above a certain grade, congratulations, you're going to the top French engineering school, right? That's how Asia's worked for hundreds and hundreds of years. They invented standardized tests, right? That's how it works. If you do above a certain threshold on standardized tests, you get in. That's one way of doing it. Let me tell you, this will not happen. Colleges will not be giving up on affirmative action because American culture cares too much about the rags to riches story, about the story of going from nothing to something, of, transcending the adversity that you faced and achieving something. We are just too big of fans of that. We'll never be France. We'll never be China. We'll never be Germany. We'll never be any of these countries that care about just how well you do on standardized tests. That's never what we'll be. In some ways, there's amazing things about that. I like it, but there's downsides to it too. But rest assured, this will never happen in America. The other reason it will not happen in America is because then elite schools would have almost no Black students. So this is straight from the College Board. This is kind of how people did on the SAT. This is in 2019, before schools didn't require the SAT. So this is when all schools required the SAT. Of total students, about 7% get above a 1400. For African-American students, about 1% get above a 1400. For Asian students, about 25% get above a 1400. Again, that's a very good score. We're talking 90th, 92nd percentile. It's just a 1400. You get into 1450, 1500, get 98th, 99th percentile at 1550. If you were to just, let's say, elite schools, let's say we're France now. we're going to let in only people who get above 1,400 into elite schools. This is what elite schools would look like. It'd be 52% white. They'd be 39% Asian. They'd be 8% Hispanic. They'd be 2% Black. And they would have virtually no Native American students. So rest assured, will not happen. It'd be too embarrassing. It'd be too ugly. And on top of that, this is America. We love rags to riches. We love the underdog. And this will not happen. Option number 2. So lower your standards, raise your impact. So this is an option that a lot of progressives have been talking about for years, even before affirmative action went away, which is that if you could just lower your standards for poor students, if you could just make this affirmative action to let in more poor students, right? And say, if you're a poor student and you do better than most poor students, we'll let you in. That's simple. We want some poor students, and we care about having poor students. Now, if we did that, that would result in basically the same number of Black and Latino students because they're disproportionately poor. And we could do that. This is Rick Kahlenberg on the right. He's a progressive intellectual. He worked for a progressive think tank for years before he became an expert witness against affirmative action. He thinks affirmative action prevents us from doing this, right? He did an experiment at Harvard. He took their entire admissions data and he ran an experiment. He said, what if we ended legacies? No advantage for having a parent there. What if we ended the dean's list, which means no advantage for being supremely rich? And we just provide a big boost to low-income students. If we did that, Harvard would have 3.5 times more first-generation students whose parents didn't go to college, and we'd actually have even more Black and Latino students. So let's just do that. Screw affirmative action. That's what he says, right? Let's just do that. Georgetown, this is a study on the left, the chart, they confirm the same thing. So in this column 2 is kind of the existing proportions of Hispanic and Latino students, and then Black students, then Native American students. If we switch to making them, if they're poor and they're better than other poor students, they get in. If they're rich and better than other rich students, they get in. But we're kind of going to have separate, almost students, rich students. We won't look at race. We'll kind of have these quotas for poor and rich students. You'd see that Black students, Black percentages go up 5.9%. If it was partially adopted, we get 6%. If it was even more adopted, we get 7%. Same with Hispanics, they would go up. And the better thing, this is what Kahlenberg would say, it's even better if Black students, Hispanic students, what about poor students, right? They would go up even more. Poor students go up from 8% to 10%. Even middle-class students go up. Even upper middle-class students go up. Rich students will go down, but everybody else would go up. Let's try that. That's what Rick Kahlenberg wants. That's what a lot of people want from this. Option number 3, search for loopholes, right? So again, Justice Roberts in the Supreme Court, they said, you can write about your race if you feel so inclined. So what have universities done? They've added an essay question. In many, many cases, this is Johns Hopkins. Tell us about an aspect of your identity, e.g. race, gender, sexuality, religion, community, right? They are asking you, if you're Black, here is where you mention it. Please, if you're Black, please mention it, right? Columbia Law School went a step further. They said, we have this essay question that you have to answer by video. You have to answer this question by video. And so a conservative reporter reached out and said, isn't this kind of just blatantly illegal? You just want to see their race. And so Columbia said, oh, our apologies. We didn't even mean to upload that question. Our bad. That question was a mistake. They take down the question immediately. But you can see what's going through their head. They're trying to get around this, right? This is how they're thinking. They're thinking, we can't just ask students, what's your race? We'll ask them to talk about their race, right? And this happens at school after school after school. And some are more wink and nod than others. But some Black students, the ones who have really good advice, the ones who have really good guidance counselors, the ones who have parents who went to college, they're being pretty clear with them. You should include your race in your essay, right? And there are students who wrote an essay in May or June, trying to apply to college this year. And then this Supreme Court decision came and they changed their whole essay, right? New York Times wrote a whole article about these students. They had an essay, they changed it, right? So let's talk about which options they're doing. So one way to evaluate the evidence, well, we'll just look at, since the colleges aren't going to tell us, we'll just look at where Black students end up, right? So this is a graph of average SAT scores, kind of how elite a university is on the x-axis, and the y-axis is how Black the university is. So the elite schools, again, they have 8, 9% Black students. That's schools like Harvard, a school like Georgetown. The worst schools also have some Black students. This is a school like Arkansas State. Everybody who applies to Arkansas State gets in. It's a 99% acceptance rate school. If you go and you're willing to find a place to live and pay us the small tuition we have, you can go, right? And as you get up the chain, you have less and less Black students, right? And you get to about, let's say schools with average SAT 1100. Think a school like VCU, huge school, diverse state, but not that many black students, right? Because the black students who have 1200 or 1100, they can go to better schools because schools will give them a bit of a leg up. Maybe a school like Ohio State will give them a bit of a leg up. Maybe a school like Wisconsin will give them a bit of a leg up, right? And the black students with 1400s, who might be the average at Wisconsin, they'll get into Georgetown, they'll get into Harvard, right? So in theory, right, if schools just gave up, then you would see these black students at Georgetown, at Harvard, at elite schools, they would kind of flow down a little bit. They wouldn't not go to college, but they would go to Wisco, right? They go to the University of Wisconsin, they go to Ohio State, they go to good schools, but they wouldn't go to the absolute elite schools. A lot of these black students, there's still be some, remember, there'd be 2% of elite schools would be black if they just gave up, right? If option 2 is followed, again, this option was like lower the standards for poor students, just try to get as many poor students as possible. Then you'd be also really able to observe it because the elite schools would be touting it. They'd be saying we have 30% poor students, right? So that you also be able to observe. Option 3, if option 3 works, if they can really do the loopholes, then you'd see no change at all. You'd see the exact same black percentage. And that's what schools seems like they're hoping for that. So before the next Supreme Court case, before this stuff is subpoenaed, we just keep an eye on this stuff. We can just look, where are black students, and we should be able to figure it out a little bit. Which of these options will actually happen? I don't really fully know. It's probably a bit of a mix. They're definitely doing option 3. They're definitely trying to search for loopholes. And that's all we really know so far because the next class hasn't been released. Once we look at kind of the numbers, as I was saying, maybe we can try to see what's going on. And eventually, maybe there'll be another Supreme Court case. The Supreme Court doesn't seem especially happy with these essay changes. The people who sued the universities and won, they made these they say they're really upset with these essay changes. So it's definitely possible that we'll see another Supreme Court case, and then we'll be able to peer inside the documents and see what's going on. But so far, all we really know is that they're definitely searching for loopholes. It's only been a year, and they're definitely searching for loopholes. So some final conclusions before the questions. As long as there are admissions offices, and there will be admissions offices, as long as America has a rags to riches culture, there will always be affirmative action. People will always want to see a black student from Compton make it to Harvard. People will always want to see that. There's a market for that in our minds. And as long as we want to see that, then it will happen, right? And the other thing is that admissions offices are sneaky, they're opaque, and they're unresponsive to public demand. They do what they want, right? It's up to them to do what they want. And no one is going to get in the middle of them. Again, they got rid of quotas, and what admissions offices do, they just widen the quotas, right? They're not very responsive to what we ask of them. The last point is since colleges are leaning on option 3, we won't know exactly what's going on because again, they're kind of using the loopholes. And so we won't know 100% what's going on, but we'll do our best to evaluate it and kind of figure it out. But these are kind of the conclusions we have so far. So yeah, that's all I have. Ready for questions.
So we will have questions, and now I would just like to say, as kind of the gatekeeper here, you could use that word, that we want to be civil. We don't want to get into any kinds of major debates or arguments. We want good behavior from everyone, and we don't want long monologues. So I'm going to pay a little attention. If you're talking for like more than 2 minutes, I might cut you off because we want to give everybody a chance, and we found that works well. So if you want to raise your hand, that's fine, or find some other way of signaling me. So Martin and Roz have their hand up, and why don't you see if you can unmute yourself?
I'm
call on
unmuted.
Martin and Roz.
I should be unmuted. I unmuted my microphone.
Yeah, it's working great. I can hear you.
Okay. I found your very, very interesting. I had no idea what was going on like that. But my question to you is this. We have 50 states here in the United States. Now, the teaching of some of the students would depend where those elementary schools are. What teachers are they, what kind of teachers do they hire in these schools, in the Black schools? We have public schools, yes. But if you live in a Black neighborhood, you're going to go to a more Black school than a white school. Is that correct?
Yeah,
So the
yeah.
question to you is this. When a child is coming out of these kinds of schools, we have to evaluate what kind of education they're getting in those schools, comparative, like in New York or California. That's what I'm asking you.
Yeah. Yeah. So schools, admissions offices, they definitely care about this. I mean, there was my understanding when I was applying to colleges, what I was told by my, guidance counselors and stuff, is that universities had sort of a different way of looking at your grades depending on which school you went to. And again, these are people, real people, 6 or 7 or 15 or, some small number of people who are looking at your grades and test scores and your interviews and your extracurriculars and everything that they can find out about you. And they're kind of trying to judge you and put you, over or under other students. And and they definitely look at the type of schools you went to. And the only question is when you eliminate, right, when you eliminate the Black label, right, the schools can no longer see whether you're Black or whether you're white. The question is not really what happens to a Black student at an 100% Black school, because they'll know. They're just going to know you're Black, right? They certainly do their due diligence. They'll look up your school. The better question is what happens to a Black student at Santa Monica High, right? They do not know that student is Black, right? So that student is now changing their whole essay, changing their whole application. I have to make sure that they know I'm Black because they will not know otherwise. Right. So the schools, the universities absolutely look at what high school you went to, but there can be a lot of, overlapping, contradictory things going on. They might see your zip code, but they might see your high school. It gets really complicated for them. They would like to look at just your race, but because they can't, the high schools will play an even bigger role than they already do.
Okay, well, Mark, I don't think that was quite what the question was about, but why don't we keep on moving? Rona, you have your hand up. Can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Actually, this is Rob, her
Oh,
spouse.
okay, her better half.
She's in the background. We're both here. So, just to, this is something I've always thought about. I understand kind of both sides of the picture of people talking about giving certain people legs up. I totally agree that people who have come from disadvantaged areas should have a leg up more than the wealthy who just get an easy walk into a university. I'm thinking what actually should have happened in the past is when they implemented this way of trying to help the Black community to come into the universities. At the same time, they should have been taken away the responsibility from the school boards and made it a state mandate that all schools had the same amount of educational abilities and teachers so that everybody could have everything. The people who were living in lower income areas could actually be better at bringing themselves up because they'll have people that care about them or they have more information. Because I know that there are some schools that they don't get the necessary school books and training and the best teachers. And that's my question. Do you agree that might have helped so that there wouldn't be this big gap with the not allowing it to the Supreme Court?
Same, it's basically the same.
Yeah, I mean, I think more investment in schools that have more poor students is not especially controversial. And yeah, I'm certainly in favor of investing more in poor schools. I think the issue comes down to the fact that high schools, elementary schools, middle schools, they can only do so much, right? So the most funded schools in the country, schools that receive the most federal funding, are schools in Baltimore, schools in DC, schools in Los Angeles. They receive the most funding per student, the most funding. So the reason why Baltimore schools are so bad is not really because they haven't received enough federal money. I mean, sure, you could give them they already have about $22,000 per student. You could give them 23. You could see if it works. Give them 24, see if it works. The problem is that Baltimore is a very poor and difficult place to grow up. And if your family's poor and you don't get to see them much, and there's gangs all around your neighborhood, going to a high school that has more money than a rich high school, it may not really help. I mean, it may help a little bit on the margins, but the gap is just difficult, right? And it's not going to be solved with a little bit more cash. And so the philosophy of the Supreme Court, it can't really, and this is, I think, one of the conclusions they came to, is that Sandra Day O'Connor, she wanted, we'll just fix this. We'll just fix the gaps, right? It's more complicated than that, right? The gaps, they can't just be fixed overnight. And we have tried over the last 20 years to invest more in lower income schools. In California, the lower income the school is, the more people who struggle to learn, the more people who don't speak English, the more money they get from California. Like California gives you even more money. The worse demographics your school has. So money is good, but it's definitely not enough here.
All right, well, I'm awfully tempted to jump in now because I do know some stuff about this, but I'll keep quiet and we'll call on Alan. Alan, you want to unmute yourself, Alan Feldman? Alan
Yep.
always has great questions.
Well, thank you. You mentioned about the possible solutions to the elite schools. Another solution to the elite private schools is they could start turning down all the federal money that they get, but that ain't going to happen for student assistance and for research. If they refuse that federal money, they could do whatever they wanted. They could admit me. And another thing that you mentioned too about affirmative action being unpopular, that's absolutely very true as far as I can tell. It always has been. But the only caveat I give to that too is that equal rights for gay people and gay marriage was also very unpopular and voted down in election after election until it wasn't. We haven't seen that kind of movement on affirmative action.